Recently, there was a debate between Bill Nye, the science guy, and creationist Ken Ham on the subject of the creation model and its viability. This commentary will deal with most of the important parts of the debate. Due to the nature of the debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, there just wasn't enough time for Mr. Ham to respond to all the things Nye covered. But with this commentary, time is not a problem, and the most important parts will be addressed.
The question tonight is, does Ken Ham's creation model hold up? Is it viable? So let me ask you all, what would you be doing if you weren't here tonight? That's right, you'd be home watching CSI. CSI Petersburg. Is that coming? I think it's coming. And on CSI, there is no distinction made between historical science and observational science. These are constructs unique to Mr. Ham. We don't normally have these anywhere in the world except here.
The actors in CSI are playing the role of detectives using forensics to examine current events. They are a perfect example of people using observational science. Their evidence will even include statements made by living witnesses. Paleontologists and other scientists involved in origin studies are involved with evidence that was created hundreds and thousands of years ago. No living witnesses, evidence that has been altered by weather and catastrophic events. So how Mr. Nye cannot see the difference between the two fields of study is rather surprising.
Mr. Ham and his followers have this remarkable view of a worldwide flood that somehow influenced everything that we observe in nature. A 500-foot wooden boat, 8 zookeepers for 14,000 individual animals, every land plant in the world underwater for a full year.
Noah's Ark could have been 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high, 3 decks. Its 1.5 million cubic feet of space could have held about 570 standard stock cars used on a typical railroad. When you consider animals the size of squirrels, frogs, lizards, pigeons, rabbits, etc., the average size of all animals comes out to about the size of a sheep. 240 sheep will fit in one stock car. 570 times 240 equals 136,800 animals. So when you consider that Mr. Ham's model requires there to be only 14,000 animals, you can see that there is a lot of space left over. As for the taking care of that many animals by 8 people goes, there are 2 things that we need to remember. We are dealing with a biblical account, and there is a God involved in this process. After all, it was He who got the animals to the ark in the first place. So, He could control the animals, and He probably put most of the wild animals into a state of hibernation, and left the domesticated animals, like chickens, cows, and goats, awake to give Noah's family busy work to do for a whole year. Plants underwater for a whole year? So what? Many plants, like seaweed, kelp, seagrass, etc., live underwater, and additionally, plants can go dormant for hundreds of years, like this one that was found in Siberian permafrost and was made viable again by scientists.
Another remarkable thing I'd like everybody to consider, inherent in this worldview, is that somehow Noah and his family were able to build a wooden ship that would house 14,000 individuals. There are 7,000 kinds, and there's a boy and a girl for each one of those. So it's about 14,008 people. And these people were unskilled. As far as anybody knows, they had never built a wooden ship before.
If Mr. Nye had bothered to pay attention to what the Bible says, he would have noticed that God was in direct communication with Noah, telling him how to build the ark. Surely, Mr. Nye can't believe that God wouldn't know how to do it.
People in the early 1900s built an extraordinary large wooden ship, the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, the largest one ever built. It had a motor on it for winching cables and stuff. But this boat had a great difficulty. It was not as big as the Titanic, but it was a very long ship. It would twist in the sea. It would twist this way, and this way. And in all that twisting, it leaked. It leaked like crazy. The crew could not keep the ship dry. And indeed, it eventually foundered and sank, loss of all 14 hands.
What Mr. Nye here neglected to tell us is that the Wyoming sank after 15 years of service. Noah's Ark wasn't designed to stay afloat for 15 years.
Now, I just want to remind us all, there are billions of people in the world who are deeply religious, who get enriched, who have a wonderful sense of community from their religion. They worship together, they eat together, they live in their communities and enjoy each other's company. Billions of people. But these same people do not embrace the extraordinary view that the earth is somehow only 6,000 years old.
We challenge Mr. Nye to show us the poll that was given to these billions of people, asking them what they thought of Mr. Ham's views. It is highly likely that the majority of them haven't even heard of Mr. Ham or his views on this matter. And it is a good bet that most of them haven't a clue as to what is involved in this debate as far as the technical issues go. Mr. Nye is blowing smoke.
My scientific colleagues go to places like Greenland, the Arctic, they go to Antarctica, and they drill into the ice with hollow drill bits. It's not that extraordinary. Many of you have probably done it yourselves, drilling other things, hole saws to put locks in doors, for example. And we pull out long cylinders of ice, long ice rods. And these are made of snow. And by a long tradition, it's called snow ice. And snow ice forms over the winter as snowflakes fall and are crushed down by subsequent layers. They're crushed together and trapping the little bubbles. And the little bubbles must needs be ancient atmosphere. There's nobody running around with a hypodermic needle squirting ancient atmosphere into the bubbles. And we find certain of these cylinders to have 680,000 layers. 680,000 snow winter, summer cycles. How could it be that just 4,000 years ago, all of this ice formed? Let's just run some numbers. This is some scenes from lovely Antarctic. Let's say we have 680,000 layers of snow ice and 4,000 years since the Great Flood. That would mean we'd need 170 winter, summer cycles every year for the last 4,000 years.
The assumption being made is that the layers represent annual layers. They do not. For example, there was a squadron of planes called the Lost Squadron that were lost for 48 years. The planes were found under 263 feet of snow ice. Rings, like Mr. Nye speaks of, were also found there, and if they represented annual layers, there should have been only about 48 layers, but they found hundreds of them. So, contrary to what Mr. Nye is telling you, the rings represent multiple layers of multiple snowstorms within each year of accumulation.
The famous tree in Sweden, Old Tycho, is 9,550 years old.
Fact. The age of Old Tycho was determined by carbon dating of genetically matched plant material collected from under the tree. The trunk itself is estimated to be only a few hundred years old, not 9,000. Carbon-14 dating is not an exact science, not even close. It's based on unprovable assumptions concerning the amount of carbon-14 that was in the atmosphere thousands of years ago. Results from blind studies tests using the technique have shown how flawed the technique is.
Now, when we go to the Grand Canyon, which is an astonishing place, and I recommend to everybody in the world to someday visit the Grand Canyon, you find layer upon layer of ancient rocks. And if there was this enormous flood that you speak of, wouldn't there have been churning and bubbling and roiling? How would these things have settled out? Your claim that they settled out in an extraordinary short amount of time is, for me, not satisfactory.
What you are looking at is more than 17 layers of sediments, taking up a depth of 150 feet, and that were laid down in the aftermath of the eruption of Mount St. Helens. It didn't take millions of years, not thousands, not hundreds. It took 2 years to form these layers. Major catastrophes can change the configuration of the planet's surface in a very short period of time. Mount St. Helens lost 1,000 feet of elevation in one day. 2 canyons were formed in just 5 months. Steep Canyon is up to 700 feet deep.
Also, in this picture, you can see where one type of sediment has intruded on another type. Now, if that was uniform, wouldn't we expect it all to be even?
Apparently, no one has bothered to tell Mr. Nye about igneous intrusions. Geologists tell us that over 60 volcanic eruptions occur every year. How many does Mr. Nye think occurred over the last 4,000 years? None?
And by the way, if this great flood drained through the Grand Canyon, wouldn't there have been a Grand Canyon on every continent? How could we not have Grand Canyons everywhere?
Newsflash. There are over 300 canyons across all the continents. Here's just a few. Copper Canyon in Mexico is actually 6 canyons in one and is 4 times larger than the Grand Canyon. The Tara River Canyon in Montenegro is the longest canyon in Montenegro and is the deepest river canyon in Europe. The Blyde River Canyon in South Africa is considered to be the 3rd largest canyon in the world. Kings Canyon in Australia has walls that soar 300 meters high. Fish River Canyon in Africa is the 2nd largest canyon in the world. Colca Canyon in South America is twice as deep as the Grand Canyon. Tiger Leaping Gorge in China is one of the deepest in the world. And Yarlung Tsangpo Grand Canyon in China is considered to be the largest canyon in the world. So, on this point, Mr. Nye's research team did a very poor job at research, if they did any at all.
You find these beautiful fossils. And when I say beautiful, I am inspired by them. They're remarkable because we are looking at the past. You find down low, you'll find what you might consider as rudimentary sea animals. Up above, you'll find the famous trilobites. Above that, you might find some clams, some oysters. And above that, you'll find some mammals. You never, ever find a higher animal mixed in with a lower one.
Has Mr. Nye never heard of the Cambrian explosion? The late Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of the 20th century's leading proponents of evolution, had this to say about it, and I quote, "The fossil record had caused Darwin more grief than joy. Nothing distressed him more than the Cambrian explosion. the coincident appearance of almost all complex organic designs. Stephen J. Gould, The Panda's Thumb, 1980, pages 238 and 239. Contrary to Darwin's expectation that new data would reveal gradualistic continuity with slow and steady expansion, all major discoveries of the past century have only heightened the massiveness and geological abruptness of this formative event. Stephen J. Gould, Nature, Volume 377, October 1995. So, once again, Mr. Nye is mistaken.
Now, one of the extraordinary claims associated with Mr. Ham's worldview is that this giant boat, very large wooden ship, went aground safely on a mountain in the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East. And so places like Australia are populated then by animals who somehow managed to get from the Middle East all the way to Australia in the last 4,000 years. Now, that to me is an extraordinary claim. We would expect then, somewhere between the Middle East and Australia, we would expect to find evidence of kangaroos. We would expect to find some fossils, some bones. In the last 4,000 years, somebody would have been hopping along there and died along the way, and we'd find them. And further,
does Mr. Nye really expect us to believe that somewhere in the world exists a database that has recorded the finding of every bone and fossil that was found in the Middle East in the last 4,000 years? The fact of the matter is that people have been finding bones and fossils for thousands of years without reporting the finds to anybody. And people have taken the bones and shaped them into things like tools, sewing needles, fishing hooks, bracelets, necklaces, and they have also ground bones into powdered form for use as medicine, potions, and aphrodisiacs. Surely, Mr. Nye would not be so arrogant to claim that none of those bones came from a kangaroo.
furthermore, there's a claim that there was a land bridge that allowed these animals to get from Asia all the way to the continent of Australia, and that land bridge has disappeared in the last 4,000 years. No navigator, no diver, no U.S. Navy submarine, no one's ever detected any evidence of this, let alone any fossils of kangaroos.
Here, Mr. Nye is guilty of overlooking a lot of factors. The area where the land bridge would have been is in the spot where now we find what is called the Mariana Trench. It is 11,000 meters deep. No diver can dive that deep. And any submersible that might be able to go that deep would also have to consider the following. The Mariana Trench is part of what is called the Pacific Rim, which annually hosts hundreds of earthquakes. With each earthquake comes things like rock slides, mudslides, landslides, etc. So, whatever evidence there might be for a land bridge, it is going to be buried under many tons of earthquake-caused debris. And that will not only include the debris created this year, but for every year in the last 4,000 years. So, for Mr. Nye to expect some diver or Navy sub to just casually spot some evidence for a land bridge, that's really absurd. People have to realize that earthquakes can cause tremendous changes to the planet's surface. Geologists tell us that the entire Himalayan mountain range was created by the collision of tectonic plates. And just as the collisions of these plates can create mountain ranges, the moving of plates away from one another can cause land masses to drop out and be filled with ocean water.
Let's see, if there are 4,000 years since Ken Ham's flood, and let's say, as he said many times, there are 7,000 kinds. Today, the very, very lowest estimate is that there are about 8.7 million species But a much more reasonable estimate is it's 50 million or even 100 million when you start counting the viruses and the bacteria and all the beetles that must be extant in the tropical rainforest that we haven't found. So we'll take a number which I think is pretty reasonable, 16 million species today.
So the experts claim that it is 8.7 million species. Yet to Mr. Nye, who apparently thinks he knows better than the experts, it's twice that amount. No, we will go with the 8.7 million. But what Mr. Nye is doing is creating another straw man to attack. He is claiming that you can't get 8.7 million species to have descended from the 14,000 on the Ark. Well, no creationist ever said we could. That 8.7 million figure includes everything that lives in the oceans, rivers, lakes, creeks, and ponds. None of them needed to be represented on the Ark because they were not going to drown. The flood had very little effect on their populations, which were in the millions, and insects also didn't need to be on the Ark. With a worldwide flood, there was going to be millions of things floating in the water that the insects could have survived on. Things like lily pads, fallen trees, branches, twigs, leaves, and things like this. A tussock is a floating island that moves around. They can range from just a few yards across to some that are acres across and can contain trees that are 50 feet high and 8 inches in diameter. Millions of insects could have survived on these. So, no, Mr. Nye, the 8.7 million species did not descend from the 14,000 on the Ark, and no reputable creationist ever claimed that they did.
I traveled the highways of Washington State quite a bit. I was a young guy, I had a motorcycle, I used to go mountain climbing in Washington State, Oregon. And you can drive along and find these enormous boulders on top of the ground. Enormous rocks, huge, sitting on top of the ground. Now, out there in regular academic pursuits, regular geology, people have discovered that there used to be a lake in what is now Montana, which we charmingly refer to as Lake Missoula. It's not there now, but the evidence for it, of course, is, if I may, overwhelming. And so an ice dam would form at Lake Missoula, and once in a while it would break. It would build up and break. And there were multiple floods in my old state of Washington State. And just before we go on, let me just say, go Seahawks. That was very gratifying. Very gratifying for me. Anyway, you drive along the road, and there are these rocks. So if, as is asserted here at this facility, that the heavier rocks would sink to the bottom during a flood event, the big rocks, and especially their shape, instead of aerodynamic, the hydrodynamic, the water-changing shape as water flows past. You'd expect them to sink to the bottom. But here are these enormous rocks right on the surface, and there's no shortage of them. If you go driving in Washington State or Oregon, they're readily available. So how could those be there if the Earth is just 4,000 years old? How could they be there if this one flood caused that?
Another straw man argument. No knowledgeable creationist ever claimed that the rocks were put there by the flood. They were created by the movement of glaciers that snapped off huge pieces of bedrock and dragged them along the surface for hundreds of miles sometimes. They are called glacial erratics.
And people realize that if this, with the age of the rocks there, as computed by traditional scientists, with the age of the rocks there, this would be a reasonable place to look for an animal, a fossil of an animal that lived there. And indeed, scientists found it, Tiktaalik, this fish lizard guy. And they found several specimens. It wasn't one individual. In other words, they made a prediction that this animal would be found, and it was found.
What they predicted was that they would find a precursor to tetrapods. And in 2005, they found Tiktaalik, which they claimed was it. But in 2010, scientists found tetrapod tracks in Poland that predated Tiktaalik. So how could Tiktaalik be a precursor to something that already existed? Their predictions were wrong.
Then, as far as Noah being an extraordinary shipwright, I'm very skeptical. The shipwrights, my ancestors, the Nye family in New England, spent their whole life learning to make ships. I mean, it's very reasonable, perhaps, to you that Noah had superpowers.
Another strawman argument. Nowhere in this debate did Mr. Ham claim that Noah had superpowers, and nowhere has a creationist ever claimed that. And once again, he overlooks the fact that God was involved in telling Noah how to build the ark.
Then, by the way, the fundamental thing we disagree on, Mr. Ham, is this nature of what you can prove to yourself. This is to say, when people make assumptions based on radiometric data, when they make assumptions about the expanding universe, when they make assumptions about the rate at which genes change in populations of bacteria in laboratory growth media, they're making assumptions based on previous experience. They're not coming out of whole cloth.
The expanding universe was not based on an assumption. It was based on observing it expanding through the Hubble telescope, observational science. Nor do they make assumptions about genetic changes in labs. They observe them in experiments, observational science. Radiometric dating, however, is based on assumptions. They assume that the decay rates of radioisotopes have always been the same, but there is no way they can scientifically prove that.
And it's just not reasonable to me that everything changed 4,000 years ago. By everything, I mean the species, the surface of the earth, the stars in the sky.
Nowhere in the debate did Mr. Ham claim that the flood affected the stars in the sky, and no creationist has either. It's just another straw man for Nye to attack.
The other thing I just want to point out, what you may have missed in evolutionary explanations of life is it's the mechanism by which we add complexity. The Earth is getting energy from the sun all the time, and that energy is used to make life forms somewhat more complex.
And that's time.
Like many reductionists, here Mr. Nye avoids the bigger question. How did the first self-replicating organism survive before it was able to develop the mechanism to convert the sun's rays? You see, Mr. Nye doesn't know the answer to that question, and neither does anybody else. And like most reductionists, Mr. Nye starts his argument not from the beginning, but from a point where you already have a complex mechanism in place. How convenient for him.
Furthermore, Mr. Ham, you never quite addressed this issue of the skulls. There are many, many steps in what appears to be the creation or the coming into being of you and me. And those steps
And that's
consistent with evolutionary theory.
and that
Here, Mr. Nye just parrots the claim made by many neo-Darwinists that alleged fossil sequences scientifically support evolutionary theory. But that is wrong also. Dr. Henry G. is a British paleontologist and evolutionary biologist. He is a senior editor of Nature, a prestigious scientific journal. G. wrote in 1999 that no fossil is buried with its birth certificate. When we call new fossil discoveries missing links, it is as if the chain of ancestry and descent were a real object for our contemplation and not what it really is, a completely human invention created after the fact, shaped to accord with human prejudices. G concluded, To take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. That was from a work entitled In Search of Deep Time. Harvard University professor Richard Lewontin. In his work, Human Diversity, he wrote, "Look, I'm a person who says in this book that we don't know anything about the ancestors of the human species. All the fossils which have been dug up and are claimed to be ancestors, we haven't the faintest idea whether they are ancestors. All you've got is Homo sapiens there. You've got that fossil there, you've got another fossil there, and it's up to you to draw the lines, because there are no lines."
And for those watching online especially, I want to remind you that we need scientists and especially engineers for the future. Engineers use science to solve problems and make things. We need these people so that the United States can continue to innovate and continue to be a world leader. We need innovation, and that needs science education. Thank you.
Mr. Nye closes trying to insinuate that Mr. Ham doesn't think that science is important, but nothing is further from the truth. In fact, Mr. Ham showed Mr. Nye some scientists who were also creationists who did great science. One created the MRI machine. No, people like Mr. Ham are not opposed to science, but are opposed to the promotion of unsubstantiated stories as if they were scientific. People like Mr. Ham also are opposed to the use of fossil frauds in museums, like the one that was promoted by the prestigious National Geographic Society in their museum in Washington, D.C. Thousands of children passed by and were told of a discovery of a fossil that supported the notion that birds evolved from dinosaurs. People like Mr. Ham also oppose the printing of Haeckel's fraudulent embryo drawings in science textbooks, something that even the late Stephen Jay Gould was appalled at when he wrote, "We do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks." Science instruction is indeed very important, but the way we are doing it, that is the problem. Professor Michio Kaku of City University of New York had this to say on one of his videos. "I'm pessimistic about how we teach science. Our kids score dead last amongst all the other developed nations." In closing, we will say this about Mr. Nye. He may be a terrific engineer, but that's possibly because you don't need to know a thing about evolution to do your science. But when it comes to origin studies, Mr. Nye is way out of his league. But he sure is great at building strawmen to attack.